Welcome. I'm Dr. Brian,
I'm Mary Claire.
and today we're going on a quest for truth on the Flint water crisis.
Game on.
The Flint water crisis is one of the most egregious environmental and public health disasters in recent U.S. history. It involves systemic failures at multiple levels of government and resulted in the lead poisoning of thousands of residents, many of them children, in the city of Flint, Michigan. The crisis began in 2014 and revealed a disturbing pattern of negligence, deception, and betrayal by public officials. And today we want to talk a little bit about what would have this looked like had we been able to know the truth earlier, and what would how might things have been better. So, Mary Claire, give us a little background on this Flint water crisis. I think our listeners are going to find this absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, especially given it was 10 plus, it at least started at least 10 plus years ago. So,
Right.
okay, first and foremost, Flint made a decision in April of 2014 under the control and the control of a state-appointed emergency manager, switched the water supply, flipped a switch. And the supply, so water, instead of coming from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which drew from Lake Huron, began coming from Flint River. It was a cost-saving measure.
And we should emphasize that, right? Everything here was about saving money to the state.
Yeah, you'll hear it in the rest of the background too. So the Flint River had a long-standing reputation of being highly polluted due to decades of industrial waste, runoff, and corrosion. I even knew the Flint River wasn't clean before this ever happened.
I don't even live in Michigan. I lived in Michigan for a long time, and everybody knew. That was one of those rivers that was going to, spontaneously combust.
Yeah. So let's just start there. That was a known fact by the common folks out there like me. So here's where it gets extra critical here. So the Flint water treatment plant did not add a corrosion control chemical, which was required by federal law under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And what this caused, this omission or this decision, caused lead from aging pipes to leach into the water supply. And so residents started complaining immediately about discolored water, foul-smelling water, health-related issues, which we saw all over the news, including rashes and hair loss. I don't remember the hair loss one, but that's scary. So
you think about this and this is an interesting thing because the chemical orthophosphate is something you put into the water that keeps the water. It actually reduces the acidity of the water, which then keeps the water from causing the pipes to leach the lead, right?
Got it.
So what happens is if you don't put this in here, then the water becomes an acidic agent that leaches this lead from the pipes. And these were really old pipes, right? The problem is that either you're going to rip up and replace all of these pipes, which wasn't going to happen, or you have to add this orthophosphate to keep the water from leaching the lead. And they didn't add that as a cost-saving measure, which is amazing, right? So let's talk a little bit about the lies. Who knew what and when? And this is, it's so interesting to me every time we do one of these that, while we're going through these things, we feel like we're being lied to, but we just don't know. And in this case, who knew and when they knew could have changed things dramatically. So what we'd love to do is really think about what would have this looked like had we known when people were lying. So let's start first with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. Remember that Flint had changed the ownership and the management of the water from the city to the state. So because they were in receivership, the city wasn't really responsible for what was going on with the water. So this is where we start first with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, or MDEQ. All right. So MDEQ falsely assured residents that the water was safe, claiming that it met all federal standards. But they actually were misleading the Environmental Protection Agency by telling them that the corrosion control measures were in place. In other words, that they had in fact added the orthophosphate, but they knew that they had not added the orthophosphate. So this is a situation where MDEQ was blatantly telling the National Environmental Protection Agency that the control measures were in place, when in fact they knew that they were not. They had not been put in place.
This is so shocking that it makes me, I'm guilty of always giving people the benefit of the doubt, for better or worse. That can work out in my favor and cannot. But how could you, did they thought, well, we're going to add something cheaper and they thought they were adding something that didn't work, or they just blatantly did not add anything. I don't know if we know,
Yeah,
but
this is a
I just
great
can't
question.
imagine.
Great question. Because, at one level you could ask, did you know that, first of all, a lie detection test that asked, did you know that there was no orthophosphate in the water, would have revealed that they were lying.
Yeah,
That's the first thing.
yeah.
But the second thing would have been really interesting. Like, did you believe that there was no need to add the orthophosphate to the water? And if so, why? Why did you believe that that wasn't something that needed to be done? This is, to add insult to injury, listen to this. Internal emails later
Yeah.
revealed that some MDEC officials dismissed the public concerns and mocked residents who complained about water quality.
That's there's no excuse for that. Just
No.
period. I
Yeah.
can't. Again, we're getting back similar to the last 2 episodes. Like, what was the culture going on in MDEC that this was acceptable? That alone was acceptable, let alone this decision was acceptable. And that culture can create an environment where what is black and white becomes gray, or what is what is white becomes black. I just, it's shocking. The whole thing is
Yeah.
shocking.
Speaking of color, one of the things living in Michigan at the time that a lot of people don't appreciate is the ethnic diversity of the city of Flint. It's
Oh
a
yeah,
heavily African
yeah.
American city, and I think that in some ways there was no question that officials at these organizations downplayed the
Oh,
importance of this based on socioeconomic status and ethnicity. I can't, you can't prove that, but it would be really interesting to do a lie detection test where you ask people whether that was part of the calculus, right? Like, we don't care about this city as much as we might care about a different city based on that structure and condition.
I didn't think about Flint like that. I wasn't considering, that's the prejudice there potentially. I would not have thought about that. Again, giving potentially people the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, okay, that's, again, we're just pulling back the layers of the onion here, and it
Yeah.
becomes further egregious.
Yeah. So then the other interesting part of this, and maybe you want to walk us through this a little bit, Mary Claire, in terms of the EPA, because remember that the MDEC officials were misleading the EPA, but they had their own insights into what was happening here as well.
Well, I'll give them the benefit, or not the benefit of the doubt. They at least admitted their fault in the end here. But so an EPA water expert had raised a red flag, or had raised red flags. This is now in 2015. So we went from March to 2014. This is now June 2015. About the lack of corrosion control and these elevated lead levels in the water.
Right.
He'd been into particular homes. There's an example of Leanne Walters, whose tap water contained extremely high lead levels. So he brought this to the attention, like we said, raised the red flag, and senior EPA officials just delayed enacting, didn't pay attention to it as quickly as needed, and they discouraged him from even publicizing the findings. Again, we've got a situation here where somebody who's trying to do something right, leadership is either pushing it to the side or encouraging somebody not to tell the truth here. And his internal memo was initially dismissed as, quote unquote, this is interesting, as a draft, as if it needed approval or review. So,
isn't it interesting
gosh,
that almost always the first reaction of any organization when faced with a catastrophe like this is to, dissemble, it's to push it away, it's to disavow, it's to really make things look like there's not a problem, and if there is a problem, they weren't involved, rather than stepping in, leaning in, taking responsibility, fixing the problem, which is what we would expect. We have lots of incentives to distance ourselves from the issues. Miguel del Toro, who was the man who identified this problem and who had met with Leanne Walters, identified these high levels of lead. It's interesting because the tests don't lie.
no.
When they get the water from Leanne Walters, it's obvious that there's a problem. There's no way you can say, well, there's no lead in the water, right? So how do you how do you justify that? How do you get to a point in your own mind where you're like, well, we have high levels of lead here and we know that's true. How do we bury this? Is it going
I
to go away?
I don't. Good question. Good question. I don't know. Like you said, it's pretty black and white. The tests come back. The tests come back, and I'm assuming they did multiple tests, or she did multiple tests. If we found lead in our water, the next thing we would do would let's do another test to make sure.
For sure.
To make sure it was accurate, but like to double down and make sure we're fully aware of what's going on. I don't. Again, it blows your mind of like, how is this not taken more seriously?
Totally agree.
And if this isn't taken more seriously, like what other things are not being taken seriously?
That's the key question right there. What else is being pushed off and, disavowed and, this idea that things aren't really happening. I mean, the interesting thing here is that we know that lead exposure for children is one of the most detrimental items to development, right? I mean, we're talking brain damage, slower development. This is lifetime impact. And to know that that was the case and not act on it is really criminal. And there were some criminal charges brought, as we'll see later. But even there, to find out what happened is also criminal, I think. I mean, the fact that the EPA later admits that it had the authority to act, and I assume the knowledge to act, but failed to do so, is absolutely a breach of public trust and confidence in the worst way.
Well, and I'm not getting political at all here, but the EPA is often, it's their job to look for these sorts of things. And if one was brought to the table and it was pushed to the side, like that makes me think what politics are going on inside.
Yeah.
Which then just burns me up. But like, because it's the intention of this agency is to protect us and protect the environment primarily, and in doing so protect us as well. Anyway, we get back to, again, culture. What's the culture?
Yeah. And if politics did play a role, like you're saying, like, I don't care about these people because they're not going to vote for me. Because in fact, and this is a great transition, Governor Rick Snyder at the time was a Republican, and Flint was absolutely not a Republican town.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, super interesting. So let's transition to that. So Rick Snyder, who was a Republican governor at the time, he initially downplays the crisis. His office repeatedly denied that there was a serious problem, despite all of the evidence. And the evidence continued to mount, right? Through the EPA, through MDAC, through other places. The evidence continues to mount. They continue to deny. By late 2015, he admits that there were mistakes made, and he declares a state of emergency. But this is only after intense public pressure and media scrutiny. I actually remember this time when I was living in Michigan, or right after I had left Michigan, actually. But they were doing bottled water for every single resident, right? So you go back to the first calculus of price and cost, and you're like, what was more expensive? Was it we should have added the orthophosphate, or we provide, drinking water, bottled drinking water to every single citizen of the town?
Not to mention, and we'll get there, but I imagine those that were impacted health-wise, they had every right to sue. I don't know if people did, but the cost would continue to mount.
Yeah.
So
later, an investigation showed that the governor's office received warnings as early as February and March of 2015, which is fairly early, right? I mean, it started in 2014, but by 2015, Miguel is raising flags in June 2015. And it shows here that Snyder knew about it in February of 2015, long before Miguel del Toro starts to raise flags. But Snyder claimed he wasn't aware of the severity until much later. So again, wouldn't it have been great to have an I can know test right there where you could say, what do you know? Did you know about this? Did you lie about this? Because that severity then goes on for another 6 months. People are exposed for 6 more months to this situation.
Well, then let's say he didn't know. Then what was going on underneath him? What was the structure such that, again, who else knew that didn't tell him? I'm assuming who's to say? I'm not going to make any assumptions, but what was going on underneath the structure such that truth was not being revealed?
Right, right. And this shows up with the local and state emergency managers as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So Flint was under a state of appointed emergency management during the crisis, meaning that local officials had limited control. So I'm assuming that means the state.
Yeah, I
If the
think
state
that's right.
appointed, then the
And
state came in.
the federal government, right? So we're back to MDEC and the EPA, really.
Yeah. So those emergency managers made some key decisions about the water source switch, and consistently sided with state assurances that the water was safe. So again, what information? How? Which we'll dive into that in a second, I think. But these officials once again prioritized budget cuts over public health and didn't heed community complaints or warnings from scientists. So I again, maybe I give people the benefit of the doubt, but how? There's all sorts of data. I don't understand how. Was there conflicting data that we don't know about? But even if you have some positive lead tests, how is that not addressed immediately?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's and it makes you wonder too. You think about this appeal to scientific knowledge and expertise, and you know that right now in our country we're having a scientific crisis in terms of what do we believe. And it's largely politically motivated, but when can you trust scientists to say what the right thing is? And I'm not saying one way or the other. Again, it would be great to have some sort of way or mechanism, some sort of lie detection test for scientists that was like, are your results accurate? Are they based on political interests or leanings? Are you pushing a cause, or are you really or have you really done this to the scientific method in a rigorous way? So the challenge is here too. This was early, but researchers and scientific whistleblower voices were completely ignored in this process. So researchers from Virginia Tech, led by Dr. Mark Edwards, conducted independent testing and found alarmingly high lead levels, and they were dismissed and discredited by state officials, at least initially. So again, here's another outside voice saying you've got a problem, and the first instinct is to run and hide. It's to basically push back and say no. And then there was another study by a pediatrician, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who released a study in September 2015. And she showed that increased blood levels were very high in Flint children. And again, her findings were also initially denied and discredited by state authorities. But they were later proven accurate. And so all of this pushback by the state was shown to be, disingenuous.
Well, we hinted at this earlier, but the fallout here from we'll see the price tag on this, which still doesn't seem like it's enough, but the legal and political fallout. So there were multiple criminal charges filed against public officials, including manslaughter, in relation to a particular outbreak. Brian, do you know how to pronounce that disease?
Legionnaire's disease.
Legionnaire's disease. Okay.
Yeah.
Linked to the water switch, again, from Lake Huron to the Flint River. So Governor Snyder was, in fact, charged with willful neglect of duty, though those charges were later dismissed due to legal complications.
Yeah.
And legal complications. And okay, so civil lawsuits is what we had earlier. Civil lawsuits resulted in $626 million in settlement for Flint residents, which again, many feel justice still has not been served, given, again, impacted children and individuals in all sorts of ways. So the what if? And again, this is another situation where somebody was trying to save a buck or deliver on, we were talking about Boeing issue last time and trying to deliver on time, but the cost associated with not doing the right thing. That's true for us as individuals. That's true for corporations. There's always a cost. And this was a very tangible one, health-wise for many, most importantly. And then, of course, dollar-wise to the state and the city. But
I'd like to jump into why we think we can get away with these things and why we think it would be less expensive to do it to have these results or consequences rather than just owning it up front. It's interesting that with the criminal charges and the involuntary manslaughter, Legionnaire's disease is a severe form of pneumonia. It's caused by the Legionella bacteria.
Oh.
It's found in water sources and can be spread through inhalation of contaminated water droplets. But it's interesting that they got the criminal charges, something that didn't even have to do with the lead, right? I mean, this was something completely different. It just had nothing to do with the additive to keep the lead from leaching. This was another form of bad water. So not only was the water
really?
full of lead, it was full of bacteria. So in this case, we had a situation where the water source was not just an issue about the lead. It was an issue about these other bacteria that weren't being killed in the water supply either. So this is, it runs deep. This whole debacle runs incredibly deep. It really was a willful neglect of duty. And how Governor Snyder was not charged, or at least people working for him were not charged based on all this, is another criminal act, I believe.
Well, we didn't get into it here, but it would be interesting to look deeper at what processes were put in place to understand what the truth was and where lie detection could have come into place. Yes, it could have come into place in moments of decision making, but even in trying to grasp at the truth and reveal the truth, the opportunity for this so that justice could be served. As we said, well, many people feel it still hasn't been served.
Totally. It's one of the things that's really interesting is lie detection would help us know what people knew when. Because that becomes one of the most important variables in all of this. If it's true that, the governor doesn't know about this when he said he didn't know about this, well, then, you can't hold him accountable for what happens. But if you know that he really did know, and it appears that the evidence suggests that's true, if that was really true that he knew 6 months earlier, before the EPA came out with their study, then that's a criminal act. I mean, you knew. You understood what was going on and you let people be hurt, right? That's unacceptable. So I think that's the most important role of this counterfactual is when did people know what they said they didn't or did know?
Yeah. Well, and even in the whistleblowers, whether it was Dr. Mark Edwards or Dr. Mona, or the EPA expert, or anybody that knew facts and could validate those facts with lie detection, it's another level of data. Now, who's to say that the people in charge, still would have dismissed it? But just layering on credibility, whether it's who knew when what. Similarly, these people knew when what, or knew what when, rather, and were dismissed. So it could have been used on both sides to get at the truth, whether to add credibility or to uncover deception at the right time.
Yeah, at the root of the problem.
Yeah.
It's interesting that we hear a lot about whistleblowers now. And in fact, if we go back to the Boeing case, the whistleblower involved there ends up taking his own life because he's not believed. It feels like we don't give enough credibility to the whistleblower quickly enough. If Miguel del Toro is a whistleblower and Leanne Walters is a whistleblower, then, how do we not? And then same with Dr. Mark Edwards or Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. These are all whistleblowers. And yet we tend to go with the people who are burying those voices. At least for a period of time, we give them the benefit of the doubt, perhaps for too long.
Yeah. This whole series has made me think, maybe, and it's my hope and a belief that there's more good out there than there is bad. But I would hope that there are more whistleblowers out there that their whistleblowing is paid attention to, and it never comes to the news because things are addressed appropriately. And truth is revealed and it is acted upon. I don't know if that's the case, but I would love to think that there are people that believe in truth, and leaders that believe in truth, accept truth, reveal truth, and make the right decisions as a result of it.
And that brings me to that kind of bringing together the idea of timing with whistleblowers. that's probably the best place to do the lie detection test, right? So at the moment of whistleblowing, why not do a lie detection test right there, both for the whistleblower and for the person they are accusing, that says something like, is what you are saying true? And to the other person, do you know about this? Did you know about this? Or, can you act on this at this point?
What actions have you taken?
What actions have you taken, or can you take? And what that would do is show the veracity of the words of the whistleblower, and at the same time disclose what was known prior to the whistleblowing case. And then we could take steps to, I think the incentives would be to take steps to alleviate these problems before they became problems, before you needed a whistleblower.
Yep. Yeah. This, as we were prepping for the show, it reminded us of the BP incident as well. It's another failure to act.
That'll be one we should dive into. That may be the next one we do. Yeah.
Coulda, woulda, shoulda.
These have big impacts, right? I mean, this is what we're really showing, is that the right amount of intervention early in this process would save a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of lives, and a lot of pain and suffering.
We've had people come to us with the idea of there are news stories that break frequently of that point fingers, often towards political figures or figures of influence. And if the news sources out there could leverage us with those that are whistleblowing or are calling somebody out, does it give it, again, like you said, further veracity? But news sources leveraging us or the technology as a tool by which to validate the claims of individuals out there. So
yeah, totally agree.
This would, anyway, coulda, woulda, shoulda, 2010, so many years ago for some of these things. But
Yep. So in conclusion, this Flint water crisis was not simply a case of infrastructure failure. I mean, it wasn't that something just broke down. It was clearly a betrayal of public trust. Government officials at the local, state, and federal levels misled the public, suppressed scientific data, and ignored the pleas of citizens. Well-timed lie detection and understanding might have changed a lot of that earlier, because these lies prolonged the crisis and amplified the damage, especially to children who now face lifelong consequences from lead poisoning. I think the incident also remains a powerful example of environmental injustice and systemic racism, as Flint's population is predominantly Black and low income, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think that's another, just the injustice of that for lots of reasons is very troubling. So very interesting. This was fun to dive into, Mary Claire. Thanks for doing that with me.
Yeah, I feel like I'm getting history lessons as we go through these, as a reminder of, while I may have been living, it's, this was 10 plus years ago, that reminding myself what happened and the deceit, as you just said, the injustice involved in all of it. We can't forget that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks to all of you who listened to this today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, we hope your quest for truth is successful.